Detroit, Michigan's largest school district, back open today, vowing to provide a COVID-free environment. NBC News correspondent Ellison Barber is at Marquette Elementary Middle School in Detroit. Ellison, what is Marquette and the rest of the district doing to try to keep its schools COVID-free?
Hey, Allison. Well, it took a lot for this public school district to make it to today. If you'll remember, in the summer, they decided to start in-person instruction again for summer school classes. There was massive amounts of protests, teachers, parents physically blocking school buses to try and prevent students from being taken to those classes. There was a lawsuit that then led to every student and teacher being tested who were in those summer school programs, and 3 students testing positive for COVID-19. In mid-August, the teachers union actually voted to authorize a strike related to concerns they had about safety heading back to school in September today. It seemed like there was maybe not a ton of progress on and off, a lot of different back and forth, slow-moving negotiations, if you will. And then about a week ago, the district and the teachers union said that they reached an agreement on safety precautions to move forward with the first day of school today, September 8th. Some of the agreements that they made in terms of those safety precautions are limiting the number of students to 20 per classroom. The district also agreed to provide free testing for students and teachers, any of them, if they wanted to take a test. They also agreed to do some hazard pay for teachers doing face-to-face instruction, and also let teachers make the decision as to whether or not they wanted to do in-person teaching or do it virtually. The school superintendent stopped by this elementary school earlier today, and among other things, he talked about kind of what they will be watching moving forward. He says they will reassess everything in 9 weeks and get a better sense of parent demand for face-to-face instruction, and also keep a really close eye on the % positive of COVID tests. Here's some more of what he had to say.
Well, one thing that we're constantly looking at is the infection rate in the city. So right now it's still at about 2%, which is acceptable for face-to-face instruction. I think if we move into 6%, 7%, we probably would not offer face-to-face. So that's one thing we'll look at in the next 9 weeks. Obviously, we'll monitor outbreaks that could happen in different schools.
And if you look back here over my shoulder, you can see actually the line of parents coming to pick up their children, their students today. You can see that they are spaced out and socially distanced. They have 2 different doors this morning. They were separating the groups. The older students at this school, 3rd grade to 5th grade, entered through one door, kindergarten to 2nd grade through another. As soon as they walked through, they were given temperature checks to make sure that they were cleared and okay to head to their class. Allison?
Ellison, I know parents there are also concerned about the quality of special education in the district. What are they telling you about that?
Yeah, I talked to one mom this morning as she was dropping off 2 of her children. She said both of them have special needs and needed to come back for in-person classes because they needed services that are only offered in person. Her daughter, for instance, she needs speech therapy. She said that she was glad that they have this option now of doing in-person instruction, but she was frustrated with some of the procedures in place at this school and around in the area, some of them necessary precautions, perhaps, because of COVID-19, that had, in her view, some unintentional consequences that made the situation for her children a little bit difficult. Here's some more.
Not being able to talk to the teachers is like a big issue because now they're not going to know that he is autistic. So if he has a meltdown today, they're just going to think he's a bad kid. And with my daughter, she has a speech delay, so she can't talk well. So again, that's going to cause issues because the teacher's not really going to know how to handle her, deal with her. And the school is basically saying, like, you got to make an appointment to talk to any of the teachers.
So for her, she felt it was very important to be able to speak in person this morning with both of her children's teachers, but she wasn't able to do that because parents are not allowed inside of the building because, obviously, of the very real risk of COVID-19. She said at the very least she felt like that could have been communicated better, or more solid procedures, if you will, put in place for some people like her who maybe had specific or special circumstances. But it kind of goes to show you there are many factors that parents are considering when they're trying to decide whether or not to send their children to school. And also, as school districts move forward with plans to get kids back in school, there are sometimes unintentional consequences. And in a lot of ways, all of this, everybody is still really figuring things out. And it's kind of just a wait and see what problems might pop up. And for this woman, this mom, that was a problem she had this morning. Allison?
Allison, what a challenging time for parents, for kids, and for educators. Allison Barber in Detroit, thank you so much.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.